Voters this week telling us how they feel about Donald Trump's stance on Russia. More than half, 52%, say his apparent praise for the president is no big deal, according to a new Fox News poll. Breaking down the numbers, 31% of Democrats are not bothered by it, while 72% of Republicans aren't either. But what about those in uniform? Is President Vladimir Putin a bigger threat than many realize? We had the opportunity to meet with Secretary of the Air Force Deborah Lee James. She's fresh off a trip to U.S. bases in Baltic states. And I start by asking her, what is her greatest concern when it comes to national security?
I think the number one threat is Russia. Russia is one of the handful of companies that could actually present an existential threat to the United States. Of course, they have nuclear weapons. They have been acting in very aggressive manners in recent years, and they're also investing and they're testing military capabilities that give us pause, that are very worrisome to the United States and to our allies. I recently was in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, is suffering as we speak from the illegal annexation of the Crimea, and there's also all kinds of ceasefire violations going on in the eastern part of the country. So people are suffering and they're dying and destruction is happening, and this is happening in part because of Russian actions.
Secretary Deborah Lee James says that's one reason why today is an unprecedented time for the Air Force, which makes news every day with airstrikes on ISIS strongholds in Iraq and Syria. This while the Air Force is at its smallest in history. Enrollment peaked in the 50s with more than 900,000 airmen. But now that's dropped to less than 350,000, a decrease of more than 60%. She's reversing that trend with new recruits.
The Air Force that I remember in the 1990s was 200,000 people larger than the Air Force of today. So point number one is our Air Force is much, much smaller nowadays than it has been in our past. It seems like the whole world has changed in the last few years. We're facing a resurgent Russia in Europe and in other parts of the world. We now have a fight against this group called ISIL that did not exist a few short years ago. We have issues in the South China Sea. We have a North Korea that's investing and testing and acting in a very belligerent way. I could go on, but the threats are there, and our Air Force is now globally engaged to deter and to counter many of these threats.
Globally engaged and on call. There are 97 official Air Force bases and installations across the globe, 26 outside the United States. With so many missions to enforce, that's led to questions about overstretching human and aircraft resources, including remotely piloted aircraft.
They're working very, very hard. The demand for their services is way, way up. The demand for our manned aircraft pilots and the people who support them is way, way up. Our aircraft inventory is the oldest it has been in our history, and that means we need more maintenance and more maintainers and higher levels of depot work to keep the aircraft flying and flying safely.
Help could be coming with the impending debut of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, one of the Pentagon's most expensive and controversial weapons programs ever. Right now, though, Secretary James remains focused on what tools her men and women have at their fingertips. Her three-decade career has been dedicated to national security in both the private and public sector. As only the second woman to hold the title of Air Force Secretary, she's a huge advocate for women in the military and diligently promotes gender equality. She has this message for young women.
So take a risk, ask an important question, lean forward, and be part of the conversation.
A completely fascinating woman to meet with. And the point about the Air Force being so much smaller than it was just a few decades ago is really important because there's so much pressure on these men and women in uniform right now. So it's pretty incredible what they go through.
No time to sleep, no time to fix the planes. And so the big question comes, what if they're called upon all of a sudden? Right. Not necessarily to go bomb ISIS, but if all of a sudden there's a standoff with Russia, there's something with China, those kinds of things. Is the Air Force, is the U.S. military in general ready?
Right. She constantly went back to readiness. It's a great point.